In this episode, we will journey into how the Tuskegee Airmen got their start, how they dealt with racism, and what they did to prove that they were worthy of being in the Army, and how they fared after World War II. Roosevelt gets her wings. How did the Tuskegee Airmen get their start? The Airmen might have never gotten off the ground without Eleanor Roosevelt's help. By 1941, Franklin Roosevelt was wheelchair-bound due to being diagnosed with polio, and Eleanor was there to assist him with whatever he needed. This was the case with the Tuskegee units. Franklin was preparing the U.S. for war on two separate fronts, and Pearl Harbor was fresh on the minds of the U.S. as a country. He was unable to be in two places at once, so Eleanor went in his place. In April 1941, months before the U.S. entered World War II, Eleanor Roosevelt visited Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, where the Tuskegee Airmen had begun training. At this time, Charles Chief Anderson, Tuskegee's chief flight instructor, offered to take the First Lady around the field. Anderson had taught himself how to fly years earlier in a used plane he bought with his own savings. Roosevelt agreed, and the photos and film that came out of the 40-minute flight helped convince people in power to support the creation of a black fighter group. Controversy. Between the War Department and Army Air Forces, leadership had many themes, assuming segregation was the most efficient system of race relations and accepted the separate but equal doctrine. While defending the separate but equal system, did the Army Air Force maintain equal facilities for black soldiers? No, the facilities necessary to maintain the system were too far expensive in terms of the result obtained. This led to deeply ingrained racist beliefs that the American public and Army were willing to accept the financial burden, social unrest, and inefficiency of segregation in an attempt to keep blacks in their place. The military did not consider black soldiers as part of the American military tradition and used them only when absolutely necessary for the defense of the country or when political pressure forced their use. This approach was changed in 1943 by the War Department due to it reflecting society's traditional racist attitude toward the utilization of blacks in the Army. The belief of black Americans was that segregation implied inequality, and a second-class citizenship in a subservient role was a reality for most. This did not change until 1948 and took the bravery of the men who served to prove their worthiness and conviction for the respect they deserved. The Tuskegee Experiment. Between 1939 and 1945, the War Department and U.S. Army Air Forces decided to do an experiment to see if allowing black Americans to join and train while maintaining segregation would be of any value to the war effort, at home or abroad. Was the experiment a success? The Tuskegee Airmen were a group of primarily African-American military pilots who fought in World War II. They formed the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bombardment Group of the U.S. Army Air Forces. All black military pilots who trained in the U.S. trained at Greer Field, Kennedy Field, Moton Field, Shorter Field, and the Tuskegee Army Airfields. They were educated at the Tuskegee Institute, now the Tuskegee University, located near Tuskegee, Alabama. During World War II, black Americans in many U.S. states were still subject to the Jim Crow laws, and the American military was racially segregated, as was much of the federal government. The Tuskegee Airmen were subjected to discrimination both within and outside of the Army. When the pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group painted the tails of their P-47s red, the nickname Red Tails was coined. The red markings that distinguished the Tuskegee Airmen included red bands on the noses of P-51s, as well as red rudders. The P-51B, C, and D Mustangs flew with similar color schemes, with red propeller spinners, yellow wing bands, and all red tail surfaces. The Tuskegee Airmen received further training in French Morocco before their first mission on June 2, 1943, a strafing attack on Pantelleria Island, an Italian island in the Mediterranean Sea. Later that year, the Army activated 3 more squadrons that joined in 1944 by the 99th, constituted the 332nd Fighter Group. It fought in the European theater and was most noted as one of the Army Air Force's most successful and most decorated escort groups. War to prove worthiness. Black Americans who enlisted faced racial barriers as well as segregation in the world's greatest military and had to prove They were as worthy as their white counterparts, not only fighting the war against Nazis, but also the war against racism. How did they accomplish such a feat? Those who possessed the physical and mental qualifications were accepted for aviation cadet training, were trained initially to be pilots and later to be navigators or bombardiers. Tuskegee University was awarded the U.S. Army Air Corps contract for its help in training of America's first black military aviators because it had already invested in the development of an airfield and had proven civilian pilot training program, and its graduates performed the highest on-flight aptitude exams. The 332nd Fighter Group consisted originally of 4 fighter squadrons, the 99th, the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd. These were formed after the successful rate of enlistment and retention into the 332nd. From 1941 to 1946, some 1,000 black pilots were trained at Tuskegee. The airmen's success in escorting bombers during World War II, having one of the lowest loss records of all escort fighter groups, and in being in constant demand for their services by the Allied bomber units, is a record unmatched by any other fighter group. The 99th Squadron distinguished itself by being awarded 2 presidential unit citations, June to July 1943 and May 1944, for outstanding tactical air support and aerial combat in the 12th Air Force in Italy before joining the 332nd Fighter Group. The 332nd Fighter Group was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for its longest bomber escort mission to Berlin, Germany, on March 24, 1945. During this mission, the Tuskegee Airmen, then known as the Red Tails, destroyed 3 German Me-262 jet fighters and damaged 5 additional jet fighters. The 332nd Fighter Group also distinguished itself in June 1944 when 2 of its pilots, flying P-47 Thunderbolts, discovered a German destroyer in the harbor of Trieste, Italy. The tenacious bomber escort cover provided by the 332nd Red Tail fighters often discouraged enemy fighter pilots from attacking bombers escorted by the 332nd Fighter Group. Accomplishments. Over the course of the war, the 332nd had proven themselves as worthy adversaries against the Italians and Germans, making them one of the most decorated air defense units in history. 179 bomber escort missions with an excellent record of protection, losing bombers on only 7 missions in a total of 27, compared to an average 46 among other 15th Air Force P-51 groups. 112 aircraft destroyed in the air and another 150 on the ground, and 148 others damaged. This includes 3 Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters shot down, 950 rail cars, trucks, and other motor vehicles destroyed. 1 torpedo boat was put out of action, 40 boats and barges destroyed. Altogether, 992 pilots graduated from the Tuskegee airfield courses, and they flew 1,578 missions and 15,533 sorties, destroyed 261 enemy aircraft, and won more than 850 medals. Medals awarded consisted of 3 Distinguished Unit Citations, a Silver Star, 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, 744 Air Medals, and 8 Purple Hearts. Post-war. Contrary to negative predictions from some quarters, Tuskegee Airmen were some of the best pilots in the U.S. Army Air Forces due to a combination of pre-war experience and the personal drive of those accepted for training. Nevertheless, the Tuskegee Airmen continue to have to fight racism. Their combat record did much to quiet those directly involved with the group, but other units continue to harass these airmen. 3 Tuskegee Airmen went on to become generals. For keeping his cool head in the face of Gaddafi's troops, Daniel James was appointed a brigadier general by President Nixon. He wasn't the only graduate of the Tuskegee Experiment to make a flag rank, however. James followed in the footsteps of Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the original commander of the 332nd Fighter Group, and the first black American general in the U.S. Air Force. Another Tuskegee aviator, Lucius Theus, retired a major general after dedicating most of his 36-year career in the Air Force to improving the military's bureaucracy, helping to implement a direct deposit system for service members. In 1948, President Harry Truman enacted Executive Order No. 9981, directing equality of treatment and opportunity in all of the U.S. Armed Forces, which in time led to the end of racial segregation in the U.S. military forces. Retired Sergeant Victor W. Butler is believed to be the last surviving Tuskegee Airman in Rhode Island turned 100 years old in May of 2022. Thank you for watching this episode of War Machine. Please like and subscribe. See you next time.